Hello, freshmen. This is your last lecture of the year. This is it, the High Middle Ages. This is how I usually end the year, um, with a discussion of this really amazing time period in human history. So we left the Dark Ages, right? When we saw, they kind of ended around 1050. And then we enter on this period where the High Middle Ages, where um, Europe, Christendom, the world of Christianity basically comes into its own. And we saw a little bit of that in the Crusades, where they were finally able to fight back against Islamic incursions into Christian territory. But now we're going to see how this culture, more than just the political elements, just the culture itself, began to thrive. And you can see one of the examples right here on this screen. This is a classic look at Gothic architecture. And architecture is going to be our first topic because there are feats of the human imagination. All right, in the world of architecture, guys, there are basically two types in the world of architecture in the High Middle Ages. And one is the Gothic, which you see represented over here. All right, and the other is the Romanesque, which you see represented over here. Now, I want to point out one of the features that is best shown in these two pictures that distinguishes Romanesque and Gothic architecture, and that's the ceilings, the roofs, what is over your head. If you look over at the Romanesque, that's the one we're going to be covering first. The Romanesque architecture has what's called a barrel vault. This is one that shows you that they're showing you they're restoring this church. So that's why those beams are across, and it looks not very architecturally very pretty, but it shows you very clearly the barrel vault, where it's just basically a rounded roof. You can imagine splitting a barrel in half and then putting that over your head as a roof. That is what we have there. This is called ribbed vaulting, and because if you look at the windows, you look at the ceilings, they made great use of triangles in their architecture. They made great use of triangles in their construction because they found out that and notice the rounded arches here in the Romanesque and the pointed arches here. They found out that pointed arches could support greater amounts of weight above them than rounded arches could. Right here, you'll see that, in a rounded arch, the weight would be too heavy on that centerpiece. So please make note of the fact that here you have rib vaulting and here you have the barrel vaulting. So now let's talk about Romanesque architecture. All right. What characterizes it? Well, first of all, the rounded arches, and you can see those here and here. The rounded arches, and in the building over here. First off, they had massive pillars. This was a very heavy building. They had these massive pillars and very heavy walls that supported a stone ceiling. So consequently, they had small windows. You can see on this church right here how small the windows are, and because it had to support the walls and the pillars had to support a tremendous amount of weight. So small windows, massive pillars, heavy pillars, those rounded arches, and don't forget that barrel vaulting, right? The ceiling there. So what was the effect of this? The effect of this was solidity. That these were solid buildings, but they're also kind of somber, and shadowy when you went in because the windows were very small. There wasn't a great deal of light in these churches, so it was kind of otherworldly. When you walked inside this church, it was kind of otherworldly, but it gives a sense of the power of God, the sheer weight and power of the building. And I want to also talk about Romanesque sculpture. I actually kind of like it. It was very stylized. They tended to put sculptures wherever they could fit them. They didn't try to make them natural looking. So you see kind of distortion here where the bodies are kind of small, the heads are kind of big, the legs are kind of short. This was typical of the Romanesque period, but there's something about it that's very appealing to me. So the sculpture was not proportional, but it was kind of distorted. I kind of like it. It's kind of entertaining. Now, here we see the pointed arches, right, as one of the key elements. You can see all of the pointed arches here in this picture. And also right up here, one of the unique features of the Gothic architecture, and that is the flying buttresses. What is a flying buttress? A flying buttress was actually the innovation that made Gothic architecture possible. All right, because what it did is those elements on the outside of the building, this giant skeleton, it looks like, actually supported the roof. All right, so what it did is it made walls structurally unnecessary. And since you didn't need those big, heavy walls, since these flying buttresses were supporting the roof, you could build your churches to incredible heights. In fact, when you go into a Gothic architecture, uh, you will see, you will look up. It's your first instinct to look up because you just can't believe how far away that ceiling is from you. Okay, so so you could make the ceilings remarkably high, and then you also see the rib vaulting over here, and that's in I think one of the most beautiful buildings on earth. That is the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. St. Louis the Ninth, the King of France, who led a couple of crusades. From one of his crusades, he brought back the crown of thorns, and he built as a relic, and he built this building to hold just for that relic. But it is a remarkable building, and if you ever go down to the University of Pittsburgh, the Heinz Chapel is based on the Sainte-Chapelle with these incredibly tall windows. All right. And what is that architectural element? Like we saw that lighted, it's light. Light is what makes this architecture so stunning. It speaks of the glory of God. You really walk in and you look up and the light is just pouring in, and you have these incredible stained glass windows. Um, that are supporting it, and it's just kind of stunning. The effect it has, where it's just, and I'm a big fan of Gothic architecture. And then you'll see the sculpture is very different than the Romanesque. This is idealized. They call it idealized naturalism. It's a more natural look, but definitely ideal. The human form here is in its ideal form, but expressing that holiness of the saints. So those are the two types of architecture, the Gothic and the Romanesque. Now, let's take a look at the medieval universities, which was another great achievement of the High Middle Ages. All of you, you know, we all attend a college prep school, Aquinas Academy, and there would be no colleges to prep for if it were not for the medieval times, the High Middle Ages. Universities, colleges came into existence during the Middle Ages. Now, what was a university back then? It wasn't like it is now. All right. Basically, it was a guild. Now, in a guild, we didn't get a chance to talk about this. We would have if we'd been together all year. But a guild was an there were guilds of merchants and guilds of craftsmen. It's an association of people. So a guild is an association of people working on a similar idea. So, for example, there would be a carpenter's guild, and there would be a ironsmith's guild, people who worked with iron, blacksmiths. You know, there would be a guild of workers who did metalwork and a guild of workers who did carpentry and so forth. And what does that guild do? Well, they set the standards for that particular idea, for how you make a product. They set the standards, whether you are proficient at making that product. If you had a guild that created wool fabric, then you would start as sort of a journeyman, and you would or an apprentice, and eventually you'd work your way up to a master. You'd be a master cloth maker. Right? And they set the standards for when you reach that. It's very similar in a lot of modern unions today. You start off as an apprentice or a journeyman, and then, you know, if you were an electrician, for example, and then they would tell you when you are a master electrician. Well, it was the same way with the medieval universities, okay? That was a guild of scholars, and they set the standards for what it was to be an educated person at that time. Just like our school has credits and you get credits, and when you graduate, we say you are worthy of, you have a high school education. We are sending you off in the world as a person who's achieved that level of schooling. You know, we set the standards for what that means. We have graduation standards. So that's what a guild does. And so the medieval universities were guilds of scholars, or sometimes students. They were the ones who organized the guild. Was called back then a studium generale, and that was the place for general learning, right? The Guild of Scholars. And what did they learn there? We've talked about these before, the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, the higher level of that, astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music. And after that, just like today, a student could specialize. They could go on to be in law and study medicine or theology or philosophy or some other higher form of studies. Just like people go to undergrad school and they go pre-med and then they go off and study medicine, or they go pre-law and they often and go study law. So we have very similar ideas because the medical universities are the source of our universities. Now, one of the big differences is that it wasn't a campus like it is today. You go to a college, a lot of people love visiting their college campus and say, oh, it's such a beautiful campus, right? That's not what was happening back then. It wasn't a campus. It was basically a part of town. They were renting rooms in buildings, sometimes above stores, sometimes above taverns, where there were, restaurants, if you will, down there. And on the second floor would be a classroom for the university, and that was called the Latin Quarter. Because why that was that part of town called the Latin Quarter is because it was where Latin was spoken, because that was the language of education. It was everything's written in Latin, so the lectures were in Latin. All right. Now, but it was a highly mobile institution. So if someone started taking advantage of the university and said, oh, we're going to charge this extra rent, they're like, okay, forget it. We're leaving. We're out of here. We're going to move our show elsewhere. And then they'd lower the rent. So the university had great bargaining power with the people of town. They wanted to keep the business in the town. But on the other hand, they also wanted to take advantage of it very often. And we'll see how that works. Now I want to talk a little bit about student life. Student life is kind of unique. And we see the array of students there, sort of hard at work in various forms there in that sculpture. Students generally started their higher education university at 17, and new students were hazed. The freshmen were kind of, they had tricks played on them and did all those things. And just like today, room and board were very expensive. We have tons of medieval letters. You can see them in your source book of students begging their parents for money because they were broke and they needed the money. And then parents sending back letters to their children saying, you're not studying, you're playing your guitar and going to parties, and, you're a horrible person and I'm not going to give you any money. So we have all of these different letters, these unique letters from the Middle Ages that sound very much like letters that parents might write their students today, or emails that parents might write their students today. The education was very different. Your day started at 5 or 6 in the morning, and a bell summoned you to class, just like we have bells, little dings. This was the cathedral bell. And then you went into your really uncomfortable room. It wasn't made up like some of our nice classrooms. You sat on benches or even straw, and you might listen to a lecture that goes on for hours, like all morning long, with no visual aids, no breaks, no nothing. You just sat there and you took notes on a wax tablet. And then in the afternoon, you would play sports with your friends, and that included boxing. Sometimes there was fighting, or when the river was frozen in the wintertime, people would go ice skating of sorts, there were all sorts of sports that were engaged in. But at night, you were supposed to settle in to your room wherever you were staying and do your studying. But just like today, the good students would go home and study, and the students who really didn't care about their studies would go to parties or go to taverns and just have a really good time. So nothing has changed from the beginning of the universities to today. At first, the students who went to the universities were middle class students, merchants' children. The nobles didn't see the value in education, but the world was becoming more literate. And so government officials needed literate students, people who could write and people who could who understood the law and all of those other elements, because it was going away from the custom. Remember, we're moving away from the custom of the tribal societies, and we're into much more stable, more evolved civilization. So later, the nobility did see that. They were tired of all these merchant kids getting all these government positions. So they started to send their kids from the nobility's family, the aristocracy's family, to the universities. All right, what did the universities leave behind us? First of all, the legacy of the universities is group instruction. That's when it started. When we started to, instead of dealing with scholars individually, you went with group instruction. You had a huge group of people together, and that's what was pictured there. Handing out academic degrees. I have an illustration of a modern academic degree right up here. And then you have the liberal arts curriculum, the kind of things we study, the languages, the literature, the sciences. All of these things were meant to, just like the trivium and the quadrivium, were meant to make you free. That's what liberal arts means. Your liber is free. You become free. You're not bound by your ignorance anymore. You also needed to be you have a formal teaching license. That's something that the university gave. You couldn't just step up there and start talking. You had to have some experience and some understanding. And they also gave us the cap and gown at graduation, right? Which we see a little illustration of here. People coming out in their caps and gowns. That is a medieval holdover. That's why when you guys graduate, you will wear caps and gowns in that way. All right, on we go to the next and last, and we're going to be discussing this as probably our last class, and that is medieval philosophy, which was unique and tremendous. And one of the great achievements of the human intellect was what went on in the Middle Ages. Basically, what they sought to do was to reconcile the perceived conflict between faith and reason. Remember Averroes, the Muslim philosopher. He talked about the twofold truth, that there were the truths of science and the truths of faith, and the two did not go together, okay? And Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, our patron at our school, he taught that no, faith and reason are harmonious. And that's tough for a lot of people to accept, even today. John Paul II wrote a famous encyclical letter called Fides et Ratio, where he tried to explain that indeed faith and reason are harmonious. They do work together. All right. Now, what were the foundations of the medieval philosophy? Well, first it was Greek philosophy. You had Plato and Aristotle and all of the great Greek scientific literature that came to the West. You had the early church fathers like St. Ambrose and St. Augustine, who wrote The City of God and other great books, and St. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin from the Greek, right? And they had commentaries on scriptures. You had the early medieval scholars like Gregory the Great, who wrote Pastoral Care, the Pope St. Gregory, and the Venerable Bede, who wrote commentaries and a famous history of England. And then finally, sacred scripture, which was the foundation of everything. And what did these guys study? Well, they studied intensely and debated widely. This was not this was a place of debate and study and struggle with ideas and the basic questions of human existence. What is the nature of human beings? What is the nature of God? How do God and man interrelate? What is the purpose of life? What our ethics should be? What is morality? What is the morally right thing to do? And all their classes concerned these heavy questions. Now, they did this in a unique style, and that style was called scholasticism. And this was the method of learning that was practiced in the High Middle Ages. It started very early on, even so far back as Charlemagne. But its central feature is what was called the disputation. All right, they would bring in a question, any kind of not a controversial question, but any question that needed to be answered. So we'll do the classic one here for this example. It's not the one we're going to be doing in our last get together, but you will see that when we get to it. That one is about just war. But they would ask a question. Thomas is famous, does God exist? That would be the question. And a group of guys would get into a room, right? And there would be a master scholar present, and then he would have his senior, if you will, a senior student, a bachelor, and they would, that's what it's called, like we have a bachelor's degree. Well, he was called the bachelor, and the bachelor would pose objections and questions to the master. They would, and a whole bunch of other scholars would do it too. And somebody would be scribbling all of these ideas down, okay? And then they would analyze all the possibilities and they would come up with an answer after a heavy duty analysis. But they wouldn't abandon the objections that they came up with. They would include the objections in their final discourse when they would lay it out. And this is how the Summa Theologica that Thomas Aquinas wrote is. So he'd ask a question, does God exist? And then he would give the objections they came up with. And here's the famous objection 1 to does God exist. The word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Thomas and many people make this same argument today. If God is all good, how can evil exist? It's the same argument. And Thomas, I think, expresses it better than the people who do it today. And then what he would do is he would finally, after all the analysis done, he would give his answer. All right. And he did in this case, he said the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. And the first and most manifest way is the argument from motion and the argument from design. And there's several other arguments. He gives 5 arguments for the existence of God. Many of you have probably looked at those in other classes. The 5 arguments for the existence of God. But then he wouldn't leave it there. After he gave his answer to the question, he would answer the objections. That would be the last section of the disputed question. And the answer is given to the objection. So here it is. This is the reply to objection 1. As St. Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works, unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. And only God can do that. He goes on to a deeper understanding of that idea. But that was the scholastic method, and it was a very interesting method. A lot of people criticize it, saying it just got too obscure, and some of the people who practiced it weren't as good as St. Thomas, and some of their Latin was very poor, and people made all these criticisms of scholasticism. But it has produced one of the greatest works. Scholastic disputations has produced one of the greatest works ever written, the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas, our patron at our school. So we're going to be looking at that in our last get-together in class, and where he's going to ask the question about whether you can have a just war. So that is it. That is the High Middle Ages. Hopefully you got a lot out of it, and thank you again for listening so attentively.